Hello and welcome to Live Soundtrack, a podcast designed for your listeners and viewers to learn about wonderful people doing great things within society and the body of Christ. My name is Ishani Sumchikambizi, also known as Felix to many, and I'd like to welcome you to our 5th episode of Live Soundtrack. On our podcast, we allow our guests to choose a minimum of 3 to 4 songs of their own choice, but they also get to choose a non-musical item ranging from a TV show, a film, a book, or an object of their own that they value so much. This allows us to get to know them on a deeper level and personally. On today's episode, I'm joined by none other than Major Gareth Dickens, who is the commanding officer at Winsford Corps. Major, I'd like to welcome you to our podcast show.
Thank you, Felix. Pleasure to be here.
I will stop and breathe in your presence. Just breathe. Just breathe.
I've done a little bit of introduction, but I think you do yourself justice by just letting the viewers know more about who Major Gareth Dickens is.
I'm Salvation Army officer. I have been now for 30 years. Seems like a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were Salvation Army officers, so I grew up in that kind of household. I was born over in East Anglia, in Norwich, when my parents were over there, but I grew up mostly in West London. Then went to Cardiff in Wales to university, and I studied pharmacy, and I was a hospital pharmacist back in Peterborough and Huntingdon for a couple of years before going into the Salvation Army Training College. So that's kind of moved about a bit, and that's where I come from. But I'm also a keen bird watcher when I get opportunity, which isn't very often.
Yes.
And I played rugby when I was at school. I enjoyed playing rugby. I now watch it when I get the chance. But so that's one or two of the things that I like.
So for your first soundtrack, you chose Whenever God Shines His Light by Van Morrison. Why did you choose this song?
Well, Van Morrison's one of my favourite artists, has been since I was a teenager. My dad joined the record library at the local library. You could go and get a record or a couple of records for a week or so. And they also had cassettes, because I had a cassette player in my bedroom. And I selected this one. It looked interesting. It was a Van Morrison one, and I thought, I like this guy. But this particular track, when I was at university, he released an album during my final year called Avalon Sunset, and this was one of the tracks on it. And it just gripped me, the album did. I wore the tape out. I had to buy a replacement about a year later, and that's gone to glory now as well. And also, it got to the highest place in the UK charts of any Van Morrison song, which to me was just amazing. A song that he quite openly talks about God and faith and the importance of that, which I liked. And it's quite a singable track too as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I also remember very clearly, it actually got onto top of the pops. And there was Van Morrison and Cliff Richard, which was the most unlikely pairing. And Van Morrison, who's famously quite grumpy, when I've seen him in concert, he does his encore and he's off, and that's it,
Yes.
He was actually seen to smile, which I thought said a lot about the song and actually what it meant to him. And in subsequent years, when I've done some study, one of his biographers certainly talks about that during the 1980s and into the 90s, a lot of his music reflects the spiritual journey that he was on.
Yes.
And so this for me, resonated, because this is a man on a spiritual journey, but really actually quite openly talking about what God meant to him at that stage in his life anyway, yeah.
So for people who are going to listen to this song for the first time, if they look for it, what part would you want them to pay attention to?
I think there's a line which keeps being repeated, picks me up and turns me around and puts my feet down on higher ground.
Yes.
It's a very biblical image from the prophets and from the Psalms of God picking you up, turning you around so you're facing the right way and putting you on some solid ground. It's a line that's repeated, and there's that line. And I think also in the middle there it says, he heals the lame and he makes them walk, and you can do it too in Jesus' name. There's which is it's a really strong statement to put in a record that was being released commercially.
Yes.
But he's opening that up there and saying, what can God do through you?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it takes time. And Van Morrison's an excellent songwriter, so it's worth reading the whole lot and listening to the whole thing. But taking in mind that line lifts me up, puts my feet on higher ground. Yeah.
Heals the sick, and he heals the lame. Says you can do it too, in Jesus' name. I lift you up and he turns you around, and I put your feet back on higher ground.
As a person who is a believer, what was your journey like from being a pharmacist up to now being a major in the Salvation Army?
It kind of starts really before that. As I said, my parents were officers, so I grew up in a household where God was part of every day. He was every day kind of thing. As young children, me and my brother, my mum would always have a Bible reading with us at breakfast before we went to school. And then when we were going to senior school and we were all going out at different times, she'd always leave it on the breakfast table.
Yes.
And usually check when I got home, did I read it? And sometimes I had, sometimes I hadn't, depending on how quick we got up.
Yes.
So I grew up in that kind of environment and went to the Salvation Army, took part in all kinds of activities. And then I guess when I was about 14, that's when I really my faith began to grow very personally.
Yes.
I'd always believed in God, that'd always been part of it, but that's when it became really personal. And that relationship developed. And quite soon after that, I read lots of books. I still do when I get the opportunity.
Yes.
And there were books that were influencing me. And so I prayed, God, what do you want me to do in my life? And he seemed to be quite quiet at that point, which was fine. So I thought, well, I'll do that. And then when I was 16, I was actually, Salvation Army at that time used to take over Butlins at Bognor Regis for a whole week.
Yes.
And my parents were there on the staff because they were on headquarters by then. And I had to go along. And I just woke up one morning with this voice in my head saying, I want you to be a Salvation Army officer. And I was thinking, hang on, God, I thought you'd let me off this one. And I kind of questioned backwards and forwards that week. I'd read a book not too far before that by David Wilkerson, The Cross and the Switchblade, and how he'd wrestled with his call to go to New York specifically.
Yes.
So I kind of followed his pattern, but I think by the Wednesday, I was kind of, yeah, okay, this is you. This is what you want me to do. And on the Friday night, there was always a Salvation Army meeting to conclude the week. And actually, the then general was leading it.
Yes.
Can't tell you what he preached about. I was listening, but I can't tell you what it was. But he gave an appeal at the end. And I knew I'd actually gone to the meeting with I need to make this decision. This is what God's calling me to.
Yes.
So I think he looked a bit surprised because the theatre was sloped that the service was in. So you kind of accelerated towards the mercy seat at the front. And a lovely Salvation Army officer who's now retired came to speak to me. And he said, well, you've got exams to do. And he said, if you've got that ability, go to university, get that. God will have that place for you in his time. So I then began to think about, well, I need to do something useful in the meantime.
Yes.
And I was kind of torn between agricultural engineering and pharmacy.
Yes.
There weren't many university courses on agricultural engineering at that time. So I opted for pharmacy. That experience of talking to people in a whole range of contexts, whole different variety of people, was great experience. But always it was in mind, this is what God's called me to. This is just something on the way. And over the years, it's actually proved to be helpful at times.
For your second life soundtrack, you chose Sunshine on Leith by the Proclaimers.
Yep.
What is this about this song you love?
The Proclaimers kind of, they came to fame really while I was at school. This most unlikely duo, two Scottish twins, broad Scottish accents, unashamedly who they were. They didn't look like pop stars. They didn't sound like pop stars. And yet there was something about the music they brought. I have to say, one of their tracks is my ringtone for my wife.
Yeah.
I will walk 500 miles. So I always know when she's ringing me.
Yeah.
But this track, Sunshine on Leith, it's a more slower track, I suppose, of theirs. Very, very singable too. But it talks about the realities of life. A lot of certainly their early music, it was based on their lives.
Yes.
And reflected them and their concerns. And it talks about, well, God shines his light on you and me, and that we'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
But also it's significant because for a number of years, we had a break for a few years, but for a number of years, myself and my wife would always try and have a week, 4 or 5 days away on our own as a retreat. Now, my wife would go off to a retreat centre, which would drive me nuts. The kind of enforced silence. And I would go bird watching for the week.
Yes.
So I would choose who I spoke to or whatever. And if you're in a hide watching birds, you don't speak a lot.
Yes.
But also just experiencing being in God's creation, listening to the birdsong. And for a number of years, I went up to the island of Mull off the west coast of Scotland.
Yes.
And always when I was there for a few days, one day I would spend on the island of Iona. And Iona is such if you've never been, it's such a special place. It's described by almost everybody I know who's ever been as a thin place, a place where you can really sense heaven.
Wow.
And this was one of the tracks I'd always have on the soundtrack on my way up to Scotland. I'm getting ready for the journey.
Yeah.
And let's see how God's going to shine his light on that. And it's a great song. I think Leith Football Club, or one of the football clubs around Edinburgh, have adopted it as their anthem.
Okay.
But for me, it's that reminder of that journey up to there and that expectation of the presence of God and the reminder that he's with us in the everyday experience.
Heart was broken. My heart was broken. Sorrow, 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 sorrow. My heart was broken. My heart was broken. You saw it. You claimed it, you touched it, you saved it.
We have reached a segment now where we get to speak about your non-musical item. So for your non-musical music item, you chose a film called Local Hero, based in 1983.
Yeah.
And why did you choose this film?
But this film, Local Hero, it was one of 3 that the director Bill Forsyth brought out in the 80s. And they remind me of that time, growing up as a teenager. The first one, Gregory's Girl, is probably the best known of the 3.
Yes.
But Local Hero, I came across it first because of the soundtrack. Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits wrote the soundtrack, and I got that out of the record library on cassette. And I thought, I really like this. And the Christmas, my first year at university, I was at home for Christmas, and on the evening of New Year's Day, the film was going to be on the television. So I thought, I'll stay up and watch the film. And I loved it. And it's a great story because it starts off with this American character who's got to go to Scotland to sell them, this remote community, the idea they're going to build this big oil refinery or whatever there.
Yes.
And he goes very much of that period, money talks and all this kind of thing, and gradually gets won over by the sheer beauty of this place and the simplicity of it. And he doesn't want to go through with that. Although the locals, they want the money. Yeah. And the boss of the oil company phones him up, and he's a keen astronomer, and he says, have you seen the Northern Lights? And they see the Northern Lights. And it's a real good feel-good film. You know,
Yes.
You get to the end of it and you think, nothing bad's happened to anybody in the film. You've seen the transformation of somebody who, it's all about materialism, in somebody who realises that there's more to life than that. And there's loads of humour in the meantime, which is great to see.
There is a place where the northern lights transform the sky.
Anything out of the ordinary, you telephone me, night or day.
Modern mermaids spring from the sea.
What's the most amazing thing you ever found?
Impossible to say.
See, there's something amazing every 2 or 3 weeks.
For your final life soundtrack, you chose Psalm 95, Come Worship the Lord by John Michael Talbot. I hope I say it right.
Yeah.
Okay, why did you pick this song?
I picked this song because it takes me to a very particular place, very particular time. When I was a teenager, members from our Salvation Army Corps, where I grew up in West London, would go for several years to the Greenbelt Festival, which it's changed over the years, but certainly then it was a huge festival of music and arts for young people.
Yes.
And it exposed me to all kinds of different music. I got to hear some great people. And John Michael Talbot was leading the worship for the Sunday morning service. Now, we're talking, I think on the Saturday night, there'd been about 50 or 60,000 people there. Cliff Richard had been there on the Saturday night.
Yes.
For the Sunday morning service, 25, 30,000 young Christians at Nebworth. This guy came out on stage, a monk, in monk's habit, and a guitar, and sat there and played. It was John Michael Talbot. He'd been a folk rock musician with his brother. They had a group called Mason Prophet, and he'd given all that up to become a monk.
Yeah.
This was mind-blowing. This was the 1980s, when it was all about money and consumerism on this. And here's a guy who's given all that up, just wearing a simple brown habit with an acoustic guitar, and started singing, Come Worship the Lord. And you could have heard a pin drop, not a sound, 30,000 or so young Christians there. And this guy just held us mesmerized, and you felt drawn into the presence of God. And I think they televised bits of it that year. My mum was watching it on TV. When I got home, she said, was it really just this monk called Mason? Was it really as quiet as it seemed? I said, oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. And it's just that invitation to come worship the Lord. Nothing dramatic about it, but come into his presence. And the very peace, he sings so peacefully, and it's just like drawing you in so gently into God's presence.
Yes.
And so that you come, and you're calm when you come there. So yeah, that's why I've chosen that one.
To our listeners and viewers, what would be your last words of inspiration that you want to leave them by?
When I was thinking about this, there's so much you could say, and sometimes we say too much. I think it would be to trust the plan that God has for you.
Yes.
Trust the plan that God has for you. When I was going to university, I'd originally intended to go to Bath, and then I visited it and found it was on top of a very windy hill, and thought, not sure about this. Went to Cardiff, thought, I love this. And when my A-level results arrived, and this was, you got them by post, you couldn't phone up till Monday if there was a problem or anything. They arrived on the day we were going on holiday. I got the right grades, but in the wrong subjects. So I needed to phone on the Monday, and I phoned the university, and they said, oh, right, okay. We're having a meeting on Thursday because there's 3 of you who've got the grades, but just not quite in the right order. We're having a meeting on Thursday to see whether we can make more space on the course. We'll phone you on Thursday morning. And I can remember just sitting there praying and saying, look, God, if this is where you want me to be, and I think it is, it's in your hands now. I've done all I can. It's in your hands. I think this is where you want me to be. And they phoned back and said, you can smile now, you've got a place. We're like, oh, thank goodness for that. But there's been so many times, I think, to trust the plan God has for you, because he has got a plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was verses from Jeremiah that my mum was given when she went to train as a Salvation Army officer, and I was given when I went to train to be a Salvation Army officer, where God says to Jeremiah, look, I've got plans for you, plans for good and not for harm.
Absolutely.
And so it's trust God and be patient. Because sometimes his plan, it takes a time. And that was, the counselling when I offered for officership, the officer who came and spoke to me very wisely said, when it's the right time, it'll be the right time.
Absolutely, yes.
Don't try and hurry God into this. take on board the things that you can in the meantime, and when it's right, then God will take you on that. And so often we get caught up in trying to do things our way at our speed and what we want, and we just have to trust that God has a plan, and it's for good, and we need to trust Him for that.
Yes, that's so true. Yeah, our ways are not His ways.
No,
That's what-
and our wisdom is way short of His foolishness.
It is. But now we've come to the end of our show, and I want to really thank you so much, Major,
Pleasure.
for gracing us and setting time apart so that we learn about your journey, your experiences, and I would say I've learned so much about your journey, and I'm really inspired by what you just said right now. Trust God's plan.
Yeah.
And just your journey about how you became a major and all these things is really inspiring. And I believe that our viewers and listeners as well have been inspired.
Hope so.
And if you really want to see more of Major Gareth Dickens, go down to Winsford. He's there. He's there. So thank you so much to all our listeners and viewers for watching. And keep watching our live soundtrack as we have more people from other walks of life who are going to grace us in the near future. And also, please follow us on social media on Plexa Salvation Army and Selah Time to Pause on YouTube. There you get to see all the social media and media content that we create on a daily basis. So now I'll leave you listening to Psalm 95, Come to Worship the Lord by Michal, Talbot. And from me and the rest of the crew, may God bless you and keep listening to Life Soundtrack.
Come, worship the Lord, for we are His people, the flock that He shepherds. Come and worship the Lord, for we are His people, the flock that He shepherds. Hallelujah. And come, let us sing to the Lord and shout with joy to the rock who saves us. Let us come with thanksgiving and sing joyful songs to the Lord. So come and worship the Lord, for we are His people, the flock that He shepherds. Hallelujah. The Lord is God, the mighty God, the great King of all the gods. He holds in His hand the depths of the earth and the highest mountains as well. He made the sea, it belongs now to Him. The dry land too was formed by His hand. So come and worship the Lord, for we are His people, the flock that He shepherds. Hallelujah. Come, let us bow down and worship, bending the knee before the Lord our Maker. For we are His people, we are the flock that He shepherds. So come and worship the Lord, for we are His people, the flock that He shepherds. Hallelujah. So come